views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. There's an emerging option for communities that are fed up with rising housing costs, escalating commercial rents, overcrowding and displacement, vacant buildings, and lack of community spaces. And that's the concept of community land trusts that offers an alternative for an organized community, a way to take land out of the market and ensure that it's used to develop community-friendly projects that are inclusive and affordable. It's a fascinating concept that raises a number of questions, like what properties can be considered for community land trust designation, what communities are ripe for this concept, and ultimately what steps can be taken to develop a community land trust, maybe even in your neighborhood. Currently, there are 5 community land trust members in the Bronx, which we will talk about on tonight's program, and we'll examine all of the issues involved. Please join me in welcoming the campaign coordinator for New Economy Project. It is Julia Duranti-Martinez. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
And a board member from the Mott Port Morris Community Land Stewards, where they have their community land trust eyes on an abandoned property they want to turn into a community center. Mychal Johnson, nice to have you back.
My pleasure. Thank you for having
It's
me.
always good. Let's start with you, Ms. Duranti-Martinez. Describe what it is. I mean, even for me, and I'm around the Bronx a lot, and I had to do research to make sure I understood it fully. I don't know that people really understand what this concept is. What is a community land trust?
At their core, community land trusts are really about reimagining community ownership and asset building and meaningful decision-making over development. So in the community land trust model, ownership is shared. There's a nonprofit organization that holds the land and is working to ensure that it's used for community benefit in perpetuity. And then the buildings on top of the land, which can be affordable housing, but also commercial space, community gardens, really any land use, are then individually owned or rented. And the community land trust issues a 99-year renewable contract called a ground lease to the people that live or work on the land trust. And that is what ensures affordability requirements and governs the terms of use for the CLT. And then sort of the last thing, so along with community ownership and the shared ownership structure and permanent affordability, is ensuring a balance of representation in community decision-making over land. So most community land trusts will look for a mixture of people who live and work on the CLT, people from the surrounding community, and then the broader public in their board, and will often also have a membership structure that helps really shape the decisions around land use for the community land trust.
So we should define the term. CLT is Community Land Trust, so you understand. Now, I have seen, let's say, with a building that's falling apart, or a landlord that it is confirmed by legal authorities, by HPD or whomever, that this building is a problem for any number of reasons. And then the notion, somebody says, well, maybe we can, make it a community land trust property. Can you do that with any property? I know that Mr. Johnson is going to talk to us a little bit about, something that he and his colleagues have an eye on. What properties are right for it? I mean, there are many Bronx people who are going to look at it and say, well, wait a minute, my building is a mess. This is an abandoned lot. Why don't we do this and we could take ownership of it? Are there limits? Can you do it everywhere? What's the definition of it?
I think for any community land trust project, having a really organized community and doing ongoing organizing is key. And that can apply for really any property types. I think top priority for many community land trusts is publicly owned properties or distressed buildings that are in the process of going into city ownership, because because land is so expensive in New York and in other cities, being able to get land for free or for very low cost is essential for community land trusts to be able to do the type of affordability they want. So often publicly owned land is the top priority, but there's nothing to stop community land trusts from also acquiring lands on the private market as well.
Has that happened in the city of New York or in the borough of the Bronx?
It hasn't, as far as I'm aware, it hasn't happened in New York City yet. I know that in other cities, community land trusts have had success getting private property. Most of the groups here that are actually in the process of acquiring their first properties are doing so with city-owned property.
The city council seems to be leaning in favor of the notion of community land trust. There was $750,000 allocated for it. Is that really, that money is vital? In other words, you kind of can't do this without that support. Talk to me just about the whole funding model that has to go into that. So if somebody says, hey, we want to do this in our community, what do you need to do? Do you need to tap into that budget? Is there another budget somewhere? You have to raise it yourself? I mean, talk about the financial model. And then we'll let Mr. Johnson envision what he wants in the South Bronx.
Yeah, the city council funding is really exciting and a really essential first
It's the
step.
first time, this is a new concept, let's be clear, right?
Yes,
Right.
this is the first time that the New York City Council is directly supporting through discretionary funding in the council budget, directly supporting organizing work that community land trusts are doing. And that victory, which just happened this spring, is also a testament to all of the organizing and advocacy work that groups in the Bronx and all over the city have been doing for years. So I think this is a really important first step in terms of supporting that organizing and community visioning work that's essential to helping community land trusts launch and get off the ground. But they also need broader support from the city in terms of channeling properties to CLTs, subsidy that's going to help them, again, reach the affordability they want to do, low-cost financing, both for housing and non-housing uses for community land trusts. So I think most community land trusts use a combination of public funds as well as foundation grants and other support.
And so the mood of the city council has made it clear that there is, as I said, they're leaning in this direction. But then basically community groups would become partners with the city to do this. In other words, they're going to say, hey, we're going to work together to build a better project of some sort. And then the city likes the idea because I guess it's empowering a community and also maybe really making something of something. Mychal Johnson, let's talk to you. You have obviously been kind of fighting for a certain sustainability and equitability in your part of the Bronx, in the southernmost part of the borough of the Bronx. Where does this notion of community land trust fall in those kinds of plans to take a look at communities? And we're going to show some of the specifics of what you're looking at, but let's get the general what you're thinking about.
Great. Before we jump there, I just want to add to something Julia also mentioned around the funding that has been acquired by and given to these CLTs, budding of CLTs around the city. We've also got monies from the State Attorney General's office, from settlements, from Goldman Sachs and some other banks that were part of the mortgage crisis.
To the tune of how much?
I think $3 million.
Oh, that's significant.
Yes.
8 million
8
actually
million,
this
okay.
year.
Yeah.
We don't want to shortchange
So
anybody.
that helped us do a learning exchange where we actually went and started working with the budding CLTs around the city to bring them up to snuff on terms of how to incorporate, how to be ready to succeed. Because if we all succeed, we succeed. When we fail, anyone fails, we all fail. So we learned from Cooper Square and others like Dudley Street in Boston.
Cooper Square was a successful one in New York.
That, yes, they've been doing great work for 20 years trying to keep rents deeply affordable in perpetuity and own several buildings. But to go on to your question about what we're doing in Mott Haven and why.
Let me just say, I'm sorry, but I asked the question, now I'm interrupting myself.
That's all right.
But one of the things I said at the top was the notion of an organized community. And that's what you just addressed.
Yeah.
What kind of organization do you need? And again, as people know, our idea is to stimulate some thought in how to better people's communities. And they say, wait a minute, we like this idea. What kind of organization
Well,
do you
first
need?
it has to be nonprofit,
Okay,
right? It's
that's
not
fine.
about personal capitalism gain on
Yeah,
property
this isn't
ownership.
your real estate deal.
Right. Well, actually, it's actually
It is a real estate deal,
no,
but
we
not
look at,
for you.
Yeah, we look at it as a natural opposing force to real estate speculation, right? That's the reason we came to the idea community land trust might be a real solution for some local community issues in Mott Haven in Port Morris, because we've seen how land has been used to cause negative connotations on our community, negative effects on environmental, social, and economic opportunities. So public land leased to friends of governors for 99 years. What if a CLT, our community land trust, is able to lobby or to try to acquire that land for our own community benefit, right? For a real community need, we could be the guardians of our own public trust.
And so, as opposed to having a developer or somebody else come in and say, hey, this is a plot of land, maybe even with good intentions, want to work with the community, this is a community first initiative.
Correct. And
fascinating.
Community first is very important because the largest part, the most important of a community land trust is community, right? That we organize, and we listen to our communities as to the needs that we have and how can we create the answers instead of expecting to come from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And so for you, now you have the infrastructure with South Bronx Unite and
Correct.
other groups certainly in the South Bronx. They've been energized by the notion of gentrification. It's clear that there are properties being divvied up. I mean, that's a common knowledge in the Bronx. And so you had a bit of a personnel infrastructure to work with. And then
organizing, yes.
So that was semi-organized, and then you got people together and say, hey, we're going to do this.
Right. We not only people, but organizations and entities came together and said, well, we've already been organizing our community. How can we make sure we can look at some of the land that's available or publicly owned buildings that are vacant or public spaces and make sure they stay community owned, like community gardens, which have been in jeopardy of being built upon depending on whom's initiative, whoever's the mayor. Okay, we're going to build 1,000 units of housing and we're going to build some on community gardens. So we're looking at public space, green space, how that can be community owned in perpetuity.
So let's talk about this specific project. Yeah. So now we can even put up, we got a picture of this building. This is a photo from the 80s. Right. Describe what this is. This is the old Lincoln Medical Center?
This is the old Lincoln Detox Center, or Lincoln Recovery Center.
Okay, so we can put those pictures up there. Go ahead.
In the early 70s.
Yeah, there's a picture of it.
Right. Early to mid 70s, the old Lincoln Hospital, there was a point where there was such bad service there that the community came together with the Young Lords and the Black Panthers to recover that space
and say for 20 Bronx history.
Right, for 24 hours they created a takeover of the hospital, and they had a multiple point plan of what kind of services the community needed. Right, out of that came the acupuncture clinic at this building at the Lincoln, which is called the Lincoln Recovery Center, but it was the People's Detox Center.
Located at
140th Street, 349 East 140th Street, and this building became a real local focal point for community health, where they came for women clinic, acupuncture for substance abuse instead of methadone. So acupuncture and Reiki as a recovery method, which was very productive, which now is still being done nationally and internationally.
Mm-hmm. But the building is now vacant.
The building became vacant in 2011. The city relocated the Lincoln Recovery Center to Belvis, which is several blocks away, left this vacant. Turned the heat off, left water in the pipes. Pipes burst, black mold. It still sits in a dilapidated state. Mm-hmm. We came in as a community and said, we want to create something for the community here. We received some funding to do a feasibility study, and the city gave us a license agreement to go in and to actually determine what is the state of the structure and what we can do with it. Mm-hmm. And so it took a year, and we finished our feasibility study where we came out from 12 different visioning sessions throughout the community of health, education, and the arts. We called it the Heart Center. The
Heart Center, and so in a way, it's like many of the community centers that we have in the Bronx, and that's what you envision for that spot.
Yeah, a little bit different.
And we have a map, too, to show people exactly where it's located.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, right. It sits really in the center of an area where we have public housing. We have one of the poorest performing schools in our district, which is the poorest performing school district, PS 49. But we're right in the center of a real interesting location where there's playground, parks, public housing, public schools, and our children are there. We're trying to create a different opportunity and solution for things that are really affecting our community negatively.
From a community perspective, how badly is that sort of facility needed? Boy, is that a stupid question.
Well, we don't have any performing space, right? Yeah. We don't have anywhere we can go and get alternatives to medicine, not just using medicine, but how can we train and how can we do preventative studies and work there.
And this is the vision of what you would put in there.
It's a multiple level rendering here of showing exactly what can happen there in terms of a performance space, nonprofit space for community organizations that are already doing the work but have been threatened with displacement because of gentrification and real estate speculation.
So you feel like, let me just interject, you feel like if you can get a hold of that space
Yes.
and turn it into something that you've already got plans for,
Right.
and you can make that happen, as opposed to somebody else coming in, maybe even with good intentions, the community can own this piece of property.
Well, it's a community vision. It doesn't come from someone else's vision, right? This vision is from visioning sessions, from listening sessions, where we said, of course we have issues with housing, but we also have issues with asthma, obesity, and diabetes, which is a health crisis in our community. We're the most unhealthy county in all of New York State, right? So that's a problem. Education, again, this school district, District 7, is the poorest performing school district in all of New York City, right? And the arts. We're the contributors to the birthing of hip hop, salsa,
All of
graffiti
the
art.
above.
But our children aren't given the opportunity to really grasp that culture and be able to express themselves. So we need a space for that. They can do all of those things.
Ms. Duranti-Martinez, how realistic is that vision to be able to come to reality? How far away is it to make it reality, and what steps are needed to be taken so that Mr. Johnson's vision and that of his neighbors and colleagues can see it actually happen?
I think it's an incredibly realistic and inspiring vision, and I think there's many more communities around the city at this point. There's over a dozen groups that are in the process of setting up community land trusts that are doing similarly community-led visioning and planning sessions that are starting from a perspective of asking the community what they need and what they would like to see, instead of just accepting the terms
So
of planning.
what
and
are
land
the
use.
steps now? He's made a nice presentation here on Bronx Talk, which is, of course, the first step here on BronxNet Television. But what would be the next steps? I mean, clearly the interest is there, the inspiration is there, the creativity is there, the definition is there, the plans are there. What happens next to push it forward? Or what needs to happen?
I think we touched on it earlier, but organizing is the key thing. In some cases, there are organizations that already do base building and leadership development work that are adding a community land trust into their existing organizational structure. And in other cases, there's a group of neighbors that are getting together to incorporate a completely new nonprofit organization that's going to be the CLT. So it can start from different places in terms of the structure, but regardless, there has to be a lot of outreach and organizing with community members, going through this visioning process, identifying properties through a mapping and research process as well.
And so then going back, you're going to go to the council member, the local council member?
We have
you
support
assume?
from the local council member.
Councilmember Salamanca, I assume?
No,
is that it?
Ayala is our council person.
Councilmember Ayala.
We
in
have
that
support
section?
from Congressman Serrano and also support from Comptroller Stringer. We're looking to also reach
I'm
out.
just still trying to get that shovel.
We have
in the
more work to
ground.
do. We have more work to do. We have more coalition building, and we need to knock on the doors and meet with folks like our borough president, Ruben Diaz Jr. We're going to make a presentation to our board, community board, and more. We need people
Just
to be
to get
excited
the-
about this opportunity, and we can make it happen together.
I want to put up a list. We have a list of the Bronx groups that are basically signed on to the notion of community land trusts. And here they are. There's Banana Kelly, there's Mott Haven Port Morris CLT, which what Mr. Johnson is part of, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, South Bronx Unite, and We Stay Nos Quedamos. Are any of them as far along as they are? Talk to me about the expanse of the concept for other parts of the Bronx.
There's one more Bronx organization that should be on the list, which is the Mary Mitchell Center
Oh,
for
the
Family
Mary
and
Mitchell
Youth,
Center, that's
in
correct.
Crotona.
Sorry, we left them off. My forgiveness.
Yes, but all of these groups participated in the Community Land Trust Learning Exchange, which was this intensive training and workshop series that we did with a dozen groups around the city to better understand the model and help start the process of visioning out what a CLT could look like in different neighborhood contexts. And so I think all of the organizations at this point are very close to incorporating their community land trust structure. Many of them have their founding boards or advisory committees that have been carrying out some of the planning work with community members. And they have also, in many cases, identified their first properties and have started to have conversations with different city agencies around acquiring those.
And if I can note just one thing, some of those are CDCs, right? So they've gone from
CDC.
community development corporations
Right.
like Nos Quedamos
Right.
and Banana
Banana
Kelly,
Kelly,
right?
right.
now they're looking at the different model of CLT, of how they can make sure they can maybe really bring more community to bear in terms of ownership of these
And
buildings.
so their concept, whereas you took an abandoned city building and it was empty, it's vacant, it's available, and you
Right.
could hopefully acquire it.
Right.
You're saying that if they are already CDCs, they could look at a broader
They already
scope.
have buildings, they already have property
Properties that could be looked at.
that could be brought into the envelope of the CLT.
And would they have to be abandoned properties?
no,
Or
they could be currently occupied and fully functioning.
Then let's go back. I know we had addressed it slightly at the beginning, but talk about what kinds of things either they actually are looking at or they could be looking at as to be part of this project.
In terms of the Bronx Organizations, I know that groups are looking at affordable housing. In the case of Northwest Bronx, Mary Mychal is looking at healthy food access and creating jobs through having a local community production center that's connected with a community garden on the CLT. Nos Quedamos is exploring both their affordable housing portfolio, moving that onto a CLT, as well as their network of community gardens, and looking too into microgrids and community-owned solar as part of this broader project of green development. So there's a lot of really exciting proposals.
This notion of self-determination has been such a struggle in our borough of the Bronx and certainly Mr. Johnson knows. We've had him on here for any number of other different issues. So this is the beginnings of an antidote. And realize, folks, we're at the beginning of this process. We're not like people don't have, other than this one, I haven't seen other real, comprehensive plans. The comments that I read from various experts, real estate people and others, and housing people, it's only one tool in the toolbox. This isn't like every project doesn't work for this. And that's accurate, right? In other words, it's got to be the right project, the right place, the right organization, and things like that. What happens in terms of, let's say, a type of housing? In other words, can it be a private building that's under receivership? Can it I think maybe I read a quote from you that said, hey, why don't we look at NYCHA buildings? Is that, we'll start with you and then you can weigh in on it. Is that a reality to look at some of the absolutely abhorrent public housing buildings we have and say, wow, if the community gets together, they could take receivership and ownership of that building?
Yeah, I mean,
It
just to start by saying that we recognize community land trusts are not a silver bullet. They're not the only solution to the housing and displacement crisis in New York City, but they are an incredibly promising tool that so far has been very underutilized. And one of the things that makes them so powerful is that they address the root causes of displacement and homelessness, which is land speculation and the lack of community decision making and control over land use decisions and development in the city. So in terms of what sorts of projects are appropriate for a CLT, I think that really needs to be a decision that community members are making.
I knew you were going to say that.
You knew I was going to
It's
say it.
gotta
It's
be
in the
done
name.
on a local level.
It has to be done
Yes.
on a local level. But to the question about NYCHA specifically, and public housing and other affordable housing, I think we're talking about strengthening the overall landscape of housing and economic justice in the city, which also means supporting public housing, supporting limited equity housing co-ops and other structures. It's not only CLTs, it's just that CLTs haven't gotten much support until fairly recently.
Do you think it's realistic for a NYCHA building?
Well,
or buildings?
I think
or
it's-
even the space, maybe even the space within NYCHA that they're talking about privatizing
Well,
some of those?
it's thinking outside the box, right? I think if residents have ownership of their space in those buildings, rather than being managed, but they self-manage, we'll see different outcomes and different type of stewardship. Right now, we have a situation where our housing, NYCHA housing in the Bronx and all over the city are in really bad shape.
Terrible.
Right?
Unacceptable
Right,
as far as
totally
I'm concerned.
unacceptable. So they're doing something wrong. We're repeating the same things, expecting different results. So let's think out the box of how we can create different opportunities. So we've seen NYCHA developments or public housing developments in other cities turn into co-ops, and you get different opportunities. How about community resident ownership of these particular structures?
I would just speculate from the outside is that if you were to look at some of the buildings, and I don't want to say which ones they might be and
Right.
which projects, and say to the people, guess what? If you organized and got yourselves together, I think there would be real motivation to do that
for sure.
because they don't want to, nobody wants to live in those conditions. One of the things that came up is the notion that other not-for-profits, let's say Habitat for Humanity, it would discourage them from, and say, well, wait a minute, we don't want to get involved, that kind of thing. Would there be a competition, or would this concept be discouraging other not-for-profits from doing their thing?
That's a good question, because I think Julia can come to talk a little bit about that. There's an interborough CLT with some really Habitat's part of. You can, if you want.
Let's talk about it. I addressed it the wrong way. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was
And
just going to
Manny
say
and
that.
others, go ahead.
Yeah,
Please.
the Interborough Community Land Trust is a partnership of Habitat, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, the Mychal Housing Association of New York. What's the fourth organization? The name's escaping me.
That's all right.
But all that to say, I think the work that the New York City Community Land Initiative has been doing is really to facilitate collaboration and coordination between organizations that are directly working on community land trusts and also other housing and social justice organizations that are doing similar work. Maybe they're not trying to start up their own community land trust, but it's still complementary. And recognizing that there's over a dozen nascent efforts citywide, having competition over funding and other resources is a real concern. So throughout, really thinking through how we organize to ensure that we're building a truly collaborative movement. It isn't only this policy tool, it's much broader than that.
The notion of having governmental support and the support of local elected officials, I think, sounds just in terms of the funding and in terms of the land use and everything else, sounds like it's a very crucial element to this. One thing I just wanted to ask before we run out of time is about the notion of programming the facility.
Yes.
You'll presumably, whether you have it now or you'll eventually have entities that will program, because obviously you can say we want a community center, but these things really take know-how how to do it.
And fortunately, we were able to solicit the help from a consultant who's Bronx local, Barreto-based strategies run by Paul Lipson, and did a real thorough analysis with organizations throughout the community and throughout the Bronx that fit within our pillars of health, education, and the arts that are already doing the work, right? And they are space challenged. And they work on cooperatives also have been funded by CLT Initiative, but they also want to be a part of this.
I frankly feel your energy. You see this, I know you've been fighting on environmental justice and all these other issues. You see this as a really important thing.
It's an incredible initiative that could really create some solutions.
Julia Duranti-Martinez, thank you so much, and
Thank
say hello to
you.
all our friends there. By the way, if people want to ask, who do they get to? How do they do it? They can reach out to you?
Well,
Yeah, of
you want what you want? Email address or you
You
want
put
a
out an
website?
email address.
Okay.
Either, both. Do it real quick.
Okay, SouthBronxUnite.com.
Nicely,
.org, I'm sorry.
.org. SouthBronxUnite.org.
Nicely, nyccli.org, and neweconomynyc.org.
And
Right.
SouthBronxUnite@gmail.com.
Or reach out. You know what? If you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, you can email them to us, and we'll make sure that you get that answered. It's really important, and the whole idea is to stimulate the people of the Bronx to say, hey, we can own our own stuff. You can send us a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page, and we'll make sure to get you a response. You can be sure. We thank our producer is Helen Greenberg. Our director is Nick Marrero. We'll see you next week. Good night. Good luck in the Bronx, which we're fighting, I'll tell you that. See you next week. Good night.